Thanks for being part of our class tonight. Glad that we can all be together. Um, we are in First Timothy, picking up again in First Timothy after our Thanksgiving break, and we're in First Timothy chapter 2. And you can turn there in your Bibles. We'll be in those 15 verses, I'm pretty sure, all night and maybe into next week too. Um, We started chapter 2 weeks ago, but a quick just reminder as Paul talks about uh, urging that prayers, all kinds of prayers for everyone, be made by the church. Particularly, he mentions for kings and those in authority. The idea being that it's that um, that he wants the church to be able to live peaceful and quiet lives. Peaceful and quiet lives, he says, in all godliness and holiness. This is good and pleases God our Savior, who wants all people to be saved and to come to a knowledge of the truth. So he begins this section of the letter by saying, I want you to pray because I want you to live peaceful and quiet lives. I want you to be able to live peaceful and quiet lives. And then goes on to talk about the gospel. There is one God and there is one mediator between God and mankind, the man Jesus Christ, who gave himself as a ransom for all people. So you see that one God, one mediator, all people, right? So Paul doesn't think there's another option. He feels like Jesus is the option. The gospel is the only option. And the church, as those entrusted with the gospel, we've got to be living our lives in a way that um, that at a bare minimum doesn't obscure the gospel and hopefully invites people to share in the kind of life that we're living. And for Paul, that means peaceful and quiet lives. And we talked some about that, but I think it's important to just emphasize that's kind of where Paul is, and that is kind of the point of what follows, at least in this chapter, and perhaps the rest of the letter. This idea of living peaceful and quiet lives. And so sometimes we forget that that's the context of everything that he's going to say after this. And I think that's really important to point out. So peaceful and quiet lives. That word quiet is pretty important in these verses in this chapter. You're going to see that word three times, forms of the same word three times, as Paul talks about what that quiet life looks like. And it doesn't always mean silence. It can mean silence. There's another word in Greek that more often means silence. But quite obviously, he's not saying in verse 2 that all believers should live silent lives, right? He's not asking us to take a vow of silence. He's talking about the quality of our lives, and he kind of expands on it by also using the word peaceful. Um, so we are to live these lives that are characterized by quietness, by peace. In First Thessalonians, he talks about living a quiet life in which you mind your own business and you're not always up in conflict with people. You're not always looking for trouble, but you're carrying out your work, living your life as best you can, and so that's sort of the bare minimum Paul's saying for Christians. This is how we ought to be living our lives, with these peaceful and quiet lives, so that people can come to know Jesus, come to know the one who is the one mediator between God and human beings. So everybody got that? We clear on that? Okay. So let's pick up then in verse 8 of 1 Timothy 2. Paul says, therefore, and I've said this before, you've probably heard me say it before. When you see in the Bible, when you see therefore, you want to ask yourself, what's it there for? You want why does Paul say therefore here? Well, because he's connecting what he's just said with what he's about to say, right? Because of this, because I want you to live these quiet lives, I've got some more to say to you. I've got some more that's important for you. So, therefore, I want the men everywhere to pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or dispute. What does that suggest to you about the church where Timothy is serving? That Paul says, I want you to pray without anger or disputing.
There must be people who are kind of, I don't know, wanting to take the lead and be praying, or maybe kind of ostentatiously.
Okay.
And he's saying, do it, but kind of like what Jesus said, where you go in your closet and pray. He pointed out the guy who was praying and said, oh, how great I am. I'm such a good person and everything.
Right.
Prayed
so about himself.
They have a kind of a situation like that. Now, okay. So your wording that you read is a little bit different. And this is what I was gonna ask about. In my version, it says, I want men everywhere. It doesn't have the word therefore, by the way, in this version.
Okay.
He says, I want men everywhere to lift up holy hands. Now, in other places, like in verse 5, he uses the word, or he says between God and men. Now, I'm assuming, in fact, I think when you read that, you used the word people.
Yes.
Now, is that the same word in verse 8 that it says men?
In verse 8, it is men. It is male people.
In that of 5, it's not men?
It is, I believe, let's look to be sure. I believe up there it is anthropon, which is people.
Okay.
In verse 8, it is aner, which is male people.
Just men. Okay.
In contrast to the women who he's going to address next.
Yeah. I'm saying, is it saying here that I want people everywhere to lift up, but in this case, you're saying it's only men?
Well, now
so that would have been their role.
Well, now I wouldn't go that far necessarily. I wouldn't necessarily say Paul's not saying that women shouldn't pray in this way. I think he's saying you men particularly, this is this is a problem that you guys need to do something about. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I don't, I mean,
it was the same word.
I don't think he's saying, that women shouldn't pray. I think the women aren't praying with anger and disputing. And that's why,
like in our church or in our fellowship, women don't lead prayers in a general worship session.
Could be that as well. Although Paul in 1 Corinthians 11 assumes that women are praying and prophesying.
Oh.
So, there may have been contexts in which women certainly did that. We don't know for a fact. All I'm saying is I think specifically he's talking here to men in the congregation who are, this is a problem because the anger and the dispute is undermining their praying, right? The praying is saying one thing about who they are and what they believe and what's important to them, and their anger and disputing is sending a different message. And so Paul doesn't want that conflict between them. You remember back in chapter 1 when Paul referred to the false teachings, the things that were going on there in Ephesus. Remember, Timothy's in Ephesus. He talks about how this false teaching is just creating controversial speculations. The NIV 2011 says it's creating this kind of controversy that Paul says is detrimental to their witness for the gospel. It's basically let your prayers and the rest of your life sort of be in sync, right? And let the rest of your life witness to what you are praying about and what you say you believe in your more formal religious situations. So that's his address. By the way, therefore, interesting. Therefore is in the text. I just looked, which is it's interesting that the NIV probably there leaves it out. I don't know why that would be. In 2011, when the NIV went back and updated, they put it in. Because it's in the text. I just double checked. It's in the text. So that's interesting. But okay, so men, in order to live this quiet life, make sure you're not disputing, you're not angry, you're not quarreling, that your prayers are holy and godly, because your life is holy and godly. I think that's what he has in mind when he talks about lifting up holy hands. Your hands are holy because you've been using them to do good and not to, your life has been about doing good and not about the quarreling and the anger that has characterized them. Lifting your hands was a fairly common prayer posture in Paul's day.
It's fair to say they had a holiness problem.
They had a holiness problem.
That's what he's addressing.
They had at least they had a problem with consistency and between their as all of us sometimes do, right? Consistency between what we profess to believe and the way our lives look. And in our churches, sometimes we have an inconsistency with what we profess to believe and how we treat one another. And so I think that's kind of what Paul is addressing here, what he's looking toward. Verse 9, then, I also want the women to dress modestly with decency and propriety, adorning themselves not with elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds appropriate for women who profess to worship God. To address that last part first, you see how his advice to women is similar to his advice to men, in that the things you do ought to support your profession of faith and love for God and your profession that you want to worship God. So your lives ought to reflect that. And Paul's suggesting to them that the way they are dressing does not reflect that, at least not to maybe the larger culture around them. We ought to address a couple of things because our world is not Paul's world, right? Modesty. In Paul's day, we're not talking about how much skin you're showing or whether you're showing the shape of your body. I think Paul probably would have some things to say about that, but that's not really what's happening in Ephesus in Paul's time. It is more, we use the term sometimes, that's a person of modest means. What do we mean when we say somebody's a person of modest means?
Doesn't need much.
He doesn't need much, doesn't have much. He's a simple life. He's not extravagant. He's not showy. He's not ostentatious. So it's that usage of the word modest, I think, that we're talking about more than anything. Again, that doesn't mean that Paul might not have something to say about about women showing skin or showing the shapes of their bodies more. I don't know, but that's not what he's talking about here. In Paul's day, there really isn't the options to do that, right? There's not the sort of fashion options that we have in our culture. And so that's not really the issue. What's going on is they are wearing extravagant clothing. I actually went to a lecture one time a few years ago, a guy that I knew who did a lot of research into this, and he actually I actually showed some slides here one Sunday evening. He actually had like slides of women's hair styles in the ancient Greco-Roman world. And there was braids going everywhere, and there was gold in there woven in, and it was all, it was very, very, extravagant. And some of the Greco-Roman philosophers wrote about how these women are, going out of their houses dressed like this, just intentionally trying to turn the heads of other women's husbands. And so there was this sort of culturally, this was even sort of frowned upon in some ways. And so Paul's kind of saying, look, don't, don't come in here, with all this extravagance, because it looks bad. It's not what our culture looks at that and goes, oh, there's something wrong there. Well, who are these people that the women dress like this, that the women do these kinds of things? Does that make sense? So that seems to be what he's addressing in this situation. And so says instead of elaborate hairstyles and gold and pearls and expensive clothes, that women who claim to be devoted to God should make themselves attractive by the good things they do. That's the New Living Translation.
Yeah, Patrick.
Hang on one
On
second.
that
One
code,
second, Jacob. 1 second, Jacob. Yes.
oh, okay.
Musical performers often have advised to wear black,
Yeah.
something very modest, so that the attention is not drawn to the individual, but to what they're doing.
Right.
Which is playing an instrument or singing. And
But group performance.
yeah,
Solos want to stand out.
right.
Right. Yeah. Right. Good point. Yes.
He's saying.
Yeah.
Don't be a solo.
Yeah. Don't. Yeah. The attention shouldn't be on you. The attention should be on what you do for the Lord, the good deeds that you do as somebody who worships the Lord. Jacob, go ahead. What were you gonna say?
I think he just spoke my mind. Attention of what you do to the Lord, and so that people shouldn't focus on you, because truly, women like fashion dress more than. I mean, if you buy a clothes down for women to be changing every week, you will change a clothes. Oh yes, every week. And I mean, only last I was telling my people over there in Ghana that when I came to America, I see the difference between dress code in church and this thing. Just simple.
Mhm.
They don't care about what you wear to church. They don't care. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it has become a challenge somewhere. It has become a challenge somewhere. You wear this dress today, tomorrow you wear the same thing, tomorrow next you wear the same thing. You have two people talking about it. Is it all that he has? You see? So Paul knows women's character. He knows that this is how they come about. Tomorrow he will do a different hairstyle, a different ring, or this kind of thing for people to exposure for the distance. So he put them on their street. He put a man in the situation. Lifting hand in prayers is a culture of Jewish culture. Always when they pray, they lift their hands. But Paul is not forcing that on us to lifting hands everywhere that we go.
Right.
But
Right.
yes, it's a creating this thing for us to, if you want to lift your hands will be clean for people to see.
Yeah.
The hand that you are lifting is clean.
Right. Yeah, and all of this, keep in mind, all of this is within this particular culture, right? Not all of this is going to apply to us across the board. Christians in America have not felt the need to say to women, you shouldn't wear gold because the text says it.
No.
We haven't felt that need because there's a different sort of cultural expectation. Now, certainly, I think we should consider, right, the messages that we send sometimes, and maybe we do need to consider, what does it say to somebody who doesn't have much if you show up at church flaunting your Rolex, right? I mean, maybe we ought to be considering things like that. But it's a different culture we're talking about, and so because of that, there's some differences in the way we're going to figure out how to apply these things. The principle is still there, right? But sometimes it's going to be expressed a little differently. So just keep that in mind as we go through this. Paul doesn't say you've got to lift up your hands in worship. We don't look at this text. I don't think anybody looks at this text in Churches of Christ and says, well, you have to lift your hands when you pray, because Paul says it right there, men at least. We don't read the text that way. We don't see it that way. And I think the same can be true for his advice on the dress of women. In 1 Corinthians 11, he's going to say women should cover their heads. when they pray and prophesy. And we don't necessarily see the importance of doing that. So always we are recognizing that our world and Paul's world don't overlap entirely. And so sometimes it takes us a little bit of skill to deal with the text based on that. And that's important as we go through this chapter particularly. So you've got that statement about women dressing in a way that draws attention to the good things they do instead of to them.
And today we have the opposite. You have men wearing very expensive gold chains. You notice that not so much in the church, but outside there in the world.
Sure.
And a lot of these men, when a robber spots them, they will point a gun at him and say, "Give me your chain, because it's worth $2,000 or more." And that's very common. And in our neighborhood, I've read about in the paper here.
Yeah.
But it's just a little different shift on it, though.
Yeah.
Back then, the women were wearing the gold. Today, a lot of the men are wearing the gold.
Yeah, and you know, I'm not saying, Paul's not saying, you know, you shouldn't wear a gold wedding band. He's not saying you shouldn't wear a gold chain. He's talking about how in his culture, in his world, the dress of these particular women in these particular churches were perhaps undermining what they said about the gospel and drawing attention away from the good deeds of their lives toward the way they look, the way they're dressed. Let me say quickly, I don't think this text ought to be used to shame people for the way they're dressed or to, you know, to criticize people. Yeah, we're not fashion police at church. We're not, our job isn't to determine what people should wear and what they shouldn't. But I think it is worth kind of looking at it and saying, all right, what does the way I dress, what does the way that I choose the clothes that I choose, the jewelry that I choose, how does that reflect on the gospel and on the good news of Jesus? Because I think it can. And so I think that's something we ought to consider. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's almost like a distraction.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Thank you, Darlene. A distraction. It's distracting from, it's drawing attention to ourselves and not what God is doing in us, away from what God is doing in us, perhaps. And I know that those things aren't mutually exclusive necessarily, but I think it's worth kind of considering. So let's move on then to, oh yeah.
There's been like a hot topic there, or something that will start growing up. What is dress, how to dress, what is dress nicely, or how people might dress up, should dress up too much, too little.
Like in church, you mean, or?
It's like,
Yeah,
like,
I mean, when I grew up, men always wore a jacket and tie, at least a tie, right? Dad, generally, at least a tie.
Suits. for every church.
Suits, yeah, of course, yeah. Even before I was, by the time I was old enough to know, it was sport coats were more common. But so it was getting more casual even then, right? But yeah, sport coats and you know and fashions change and the way people dress changes across the board in our culture. We're more casual. And some people love that and some people hate it. And you can make two arguments. You can say, well, I like to dress up for the Lord. I like to wear my best for God. And other people say, well, I want to go as I am, and I want to come to God as I am. And I think there's room for both of those attitudes as long as we're not getting in each other's faces about it, right?
That there, you kept a tie or two in that office?
Yeah, we used
In the
to-
baptistry, even when I got here, there was by that time it was punishment. If you had to wear that thing, you would remember for a long time not to, yeah. But yeah, at one point there was a tie back there. Yeah. Yes. For those who were serving up front, there was a jacket and tie that were the awfulest looking jacket and tie you've ever seen in your life.
Hanging in the baptistry.
Are they still up there?
Still one in there. It's about 40 years old. It's probably covered with dust, but it's hanging in there.
Go get that thing. Go get it.
But insisted.
Yeah.
If you were up front, you
Yeah.
had to have for it.
I remember
A jacket and tie on, or you couldn't serve.
when I first got here, this is a huge digression, but when I first got here, there was an elder who did not wear a tie, and only one elder who did not wear a tie. And he literally had a doctor's note that it that it, had a skin condition of some sort. He literally had to have a doctor's note to not wear a tie. So
Yes.
I thought that was funny. Yeah,
Roy Oakland.
yeah, yes, yeah. I wasn't going to say the name, but yes, yes. Okay, so anyway, moving. Then Paul also has some other advice for women, other than just the way they dress. So we'll turn now to verse 11. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. So that is also some of Paul's address to these women at the church in Ephesus on how to live this quiet life that he's talking about. And it has to do with them, the way they learn, which is interesting. Remember Jesus with Mary and Martha at the dinner? What happened there?
Well, Mary stayed at Jesus's feet and wanted to learn from him, wanted to hear what he was saying to the men. And there was going to be a meal later. And so Martha was in the kitchen trying to prepare a meal. I don't know how many people there were, but I'm assuming there was, a bit of a.
At least
crowd.
13.
It's a lot of work to prepare all that food, and she was upset at Mary that she was sitting there listening and not in the kitchen helping to get the food ready. And Jesus rebuked Martha and said that Mary had chosen with the better way.
Better
or something
thing or the
like
better,
that.
yeah. Yeah.
And, again, obviously, I've had that experience, where I'm in the kitchen trying to get a lot of food ready, and maybe somebody else is not, kind of yell at Dan.
I get it.
Can you come
I
in?
get the look.
So, I mean,
Even Martha.
Martha
wanted
wasn't
open
wrong
concept.
necessarily.
Right.
To ask, to, say she needed help, but maybe, Mary wasn't wrong either, because she wanted to learn from Jesus what he had to say.
And that last thing you said, learn from Jesus, is the striking thing, because that was not something women did. They did not follow rabbis around. They did not sit at the feet of rabbis to learn. They didn't go to Hebrew school. They didn't do those things in Jesus's time. So Jesus was actually fairly revolutionary in that he welcomed women to be disciples. Disciple is actually, the word learn there is the word we get disciple from. Not we. The Greeks got the word we translate disciple from. It came from that word learn. Just somebody who learns, somebody who's a student. And so it was striking that Jesus had female learners, female disciples with him. Martha came to him probably because she thought he might uphold the sort of societal expectation that women should be in the domestic sphere and not out there listening to the rabbi. And Jesus sort of disappoints her, I guess, by saying, no, she's doing just fine. You're not wrong either, but she's doing just fine, So Paul says a woman should learn in quietness and full submission. He believes women should learn. He believes that Christians should be disciples, they should be learners, and that includes women. But he wants them to learn in, there's that word again, quietness and full submission. Again, quietness does not always mean silence. It can. Obviously, earlier in this chapter, it does not necessarily mean strict silence. It can mean silence. It doesn't have to mean silence. But there's a certain expectation for the way women should learn in Paul's day, and that involves this quietness and this submission is probably the bigger word here, which is a word we don't love, but it's a word that Paul uses quite a bit, and he uses it, by the way, in both directions. He also uses it for all Christians sometimes, that we should submit to one another, that's important. So it's not a dirty word, it's not a nasty word. Just because it's sometimes been misused doesn't make it a bad word. And Paul wants women to learn in this posture of submission. Now, I asked you a question earlier. You had the men who are supposed to pray without disputing. And I said, what does that tell you about the church at Ephesus? What does this tell you about some of the women in the church at Ephesus?
They trying to challenge the men and
All right.
Women's livers back then, huh?
Full submission, Paul says. And then he says, I do not permit a woman to teach or to, the NIV here says, assume authority, which I think is probably the absolute worst translation in the NIV. Assume authority over a man, she must be quiet. Again, that word quiet. So let's talk about it. Let's sort of unpack this a little bit, right? Paul said women should learn how? Quietly and in submission. And they should not, they are learners, he says, not teachers. And they should not do this thing to a man that we're going to talk about. So there's a lot of assumptions flying around here, but let's just sort of jump into it. I know that most of us have heard this text before, and obviously some practices that we subscribe to still come from this text, or partially from this text, also from 1 Corinthians. So Paul says, I don't allow a woman to teach or this other thing over a man. She must be quiet. So it's still about quietness. It's still about this quiet life. And I want you to notice a couple of verses. Turn to 2 Timothy 3, 6 through 7. 2 Timothy 3, written to the same guy, Timothy, in the same place, Ephesus, just a bit later. We don't know how much later, but a bit later. And Paul talks about some folks who have a form of godliness but deny its power. Timothy should have nothing to do with such people. They are the kind who worm their way into homes and gain control over gullible women who are loaded down with sins and swayed by all kinds of evil desires, always learning but never able to come to a knowledge of the truth. There's a false teaching of some sort in Ephesus that seems to prey on women. These teachers seem to worm their way into homes and sway these women who, in Paul's day, would have been not educated in the scriptures, they would not have had the opportunity to get educated at all, really. And they became an easy mark for some of these false teachers, apparently. Later on in 1 Timothy, Paul talks about false teaching that is connected to old wives' tales, which sort of tells you something about who maybe some of the victims of this are. Some of the particularly vulnerable to this teaching perhaps seem to be some of the women in the church. And again, that shouldn't be surprising. It's not saying that, it shouldn't be surprising because, again, you have women who aren't necessarily educated, aren't necessarily aware of the scriptures, and aren't being educated outside the home very much. Their job, their sphere, their world is the domestic sphere. That was the way it was in the Greco-Roman world, more or less. That was the way it was in the Jewish, first century Jewish world, more or less. They lived, their work was in the home. And so these false teachers, by sort of worming their way into the homes, were worming their way into the sphere of some of the women of the church and corrupting them. Later on in First Timothy, Paul talks about younger widows. He talks about widows being taken care of by the church. He says, younger widows, you ought to go ahead and get married because there's some problems that tend to arise when we're putting younger women on the roles and being cared for by the church. We'll talk about that more as we go. The other thing is, if you remember in Acts 19, when Paul first shows up in Ephesus, he creates a big old uproar. Do you remember the big uproar he creates? Extra credit if you do. The uproar was, go ahead.
It wasn't the thing about Diana.
Artemis of the Ephesians, or Diana of the Ephesians. Yes, it was. He ran afoul of the idol worshiping industry in Ephesus, and at one point there's a big riot, and people are chanting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Artemis of the Ephesians was a sort of a Romanization of an ancient, much more ancient Asian, Near Eastern goddess, Astarte, who they kind of imported into the pantheon and sort of they just sort of said, well, she's Artemis for our purposes. She's Artemis. It was there was a whole cult surrounding her, and it was one of the main points of the cult was female superiority. That women were primary, they were created first, and they were superior to men. And so very possibly there's some of that Paul is asking Timothy to deal with here in Ephesus. So in other words, there's a whole lot of stuff going on in the culture in which they're living, in which Paul says, hey, women, you shouldn't be teaching, you should be learning, and you should be learning in submission, and you should not be doing this other thing. The word is authentane. It is one of the problems with this word is that it's translated in the NIV, assume authority. One of the problems with the word is it is only used here in the New Testament. And so we don't have a whole lot of context to sort of figure out what it meant. It was used in classical Greek, and it sometimes meant things like murder or violence. But that was hundreds of years before Paul. So by Paul's day, the word seems to have evolved a bit and probably meant something more like strong arming, overpowering, dominating, and different translations will say that the American Standard says women should not have dominion over men. Which is probably a pretty good translation. There's one translation that has control. One says tell men what to do. The idea is it's more than just authority that's the problem. Paul has a word for authority that he uses about 12 times in his other letters. And it's not this word. So it'd be a little odd if he just meant authority, but didn't use it. So the problem does not seem to be, at least the primary problem doesn't seem to be authority. It seems to be women trying to dominate and control and call the shots, probably because of this false teaching that's going on. Maybe, and it's hard to know, is Paul saying women shouldn't do two things? Teach or authentane, or women shouldn't do one thing, teach in a way that authentanes. It can go either way, and it's kind of hard. Does that make sense? So it's either women shouldn't teach or dominate, or they shouldn't teach in a dominant way. They shouldn't teach in a way that dominates. In either case, Paul's response is, I'm not going to let women teach. I'm not going to permit women to teach. And so the question becomes, well, is that across the board forever? Is that just here in Ephesus in this situation? And different churches and different Christians have come to different conclusions about that. And that's okay, I think. I think it's okay to come to differing conclusions about that. Obviously, in a church, you kind of have to pick one or the other. But I think it's okay to come to different conclusions on this. And not, I think one of the things that happens sometimes is we go, well, they don't care about the Bible because of this. And I don't think that's the case, usually. I think it's how do we interpret this? How do we deal with this? Paul goes on to talk about the order of creation, if you notice, as a basis for this. And this is why a lot of churches tend to sort of say this is a universal commandment across the board.
Is that?
I'm in
is
Second
that
Timothy.
What our,
I think that's probably what most of our elders would say, and many of our, is that fair, Alan? Most of our elders would probably say something along those lines, that because Paul refers to the order of creation, that it is more than just a culturally specific situation. He says, for Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who deceived and was deceived and became a sinner. So what he's saying is, based on this situation, looking at this situation, look, women, the woman back at the beginning of creation was deceived. And so because of that, we've got to be careful here. Now,
men are never deceived?
that's an interesting question, isn't it? Of course they are. Of course men are deceived. Paul talks about
Used to say, used to see that Adam sinned intentionally.
exactly. Adam had his eyes wide open, right? And yeah. So I mean, yeah, I'm not sure. And I don't think that's what Paul's saying, by the way. I don't think he's saying that women are more prone to be deceived by nature.
But the fact is, a woman was deceived first. When there were a man and a woman in that garden, and she fell first. Yeah, that's been held against women all these centuries.
You're right. You're right.
Still, it lingers today in some ways.
You're right. Now, in 1 Corinthians 11 and in 2 Corinthians 11, Paul uses, in 1 Corinthians 11, he uses order of creation to say women should wear coverings on their heads because men were created first and a woman is the glory of a man. And so in these situations where women are praying and prophesying, they should cover their heads. We don't read that and go, well, all women should cover their heads in church or whatever. Some churches do. We don't. So we kind of recognize there are times when Paul might use that, but not as a way of making it universal, but just as a way of sort of supporting his argument in the moment. That this is a look, it's a repeat of the situation. It's a repeat of Adam and Eve. What's happening here in Ephesus. Women are being deceived and overpowering men and dominating men and bringing them into sin as well. So it could be read that way. And some Christians do read it that way and feel like it's not necessarily an across the board kind of, situation. The woman was deceived, so that means every woman everywhere is more prone to deception. We know Paul's not saying that because there's various times Paul refers to women here in 1 Timothy, in fact, or not in Titus, I believe, he refers to older women teaching younger women. Why put older women in charge of teaching younger women if they're prone to be deceived, right? Let the men teach them. So that, that kind of tells you even Paul didn't think this. In Philippians 4, he talks about Euodia and Syntyche as fellow workers, women who have labored by my side in the gospel. And I mean, it really sounds like these were women who taught in some way.
And even Timothy's mother.
Yes.
Named.
Absolutely. So I don't think Paul thinks that women are more prone to deception. I don't think that's what he's saying. It comes across that way sometimes, and sometimes the church has interpreted it that way, but I don't think that's what Paul's getting at. It doesn't make much sense when you look at some of his other writings.
It doesn't seem fair that since that time that, women have to carry the guilt of what these women did. I mean, sure, there are still women who are deceived, women who try to dominate men. I mean, that hasn't changed, but, it just seems like the assumption is, well, because some women did that, we can't let any women do it. It just, I don't know. It's not a-
It doesn't seem fair. Yeah.
And I don't know, I don't even, I wonder if Paul actually meant it to be taken that way.
Right.
That, that for all time, women are never gonna be allowed to teach a Bible class where there are men in it. I mean, did he really mean that? Maybe he did, I don't know. But of course, obviously, that's the way it's taken.
I'm friends
Yeah.
with two women who are preachers in Churches of Christ, and they are serving as preachers in Churches of Christ. One preaches every Sunday, one preaches as part of a rotation. And in their church, they would say, no, we don't think Paul intended this to be universal for all time. That's the way they would respond to that.
And I'm not wanting to get up and.
I understand. I understand. Yeah. No, I get it. I hear you. But yeah, so
But we have to be
hang on
very,
1 second, Jacob.
okay.
That's what makes the whole argument troubling. Why bring up an unrelated man and woman unless you're trying to make some sort of universal / generalizationalist argument?
And that's what some churches also say. I would say in response to that, Paul brings up Eve in 2 Corinthians 11 to talk about, I'm afraid, I'm worried that just like Eve, you're going to be deceived. He's not saying, he's using the deception of Eve as a case study, as an example of a deception.
Kind of like saying, you come by it honestly.
Yes, and he might be saying something similar. He might be using it similarly here in 1 Timothy 2. And churches that give women more latitude in public roles would say, yes, we think that Paul is not trying to make this a universal statement. And so, yeah. Jacob, you had something to say.
Yeah. Like you were saying, we have the Churches of Christ, some of Church of Christ that was, applying these rules. Women's are now pastors and those kind of things. And that is bringing a lot of confusion. Paul issue here is, first of all, why Jesus was naming the apostle, there is no woman among them. That was the first question that we should ask ourselves. Why? When Jesus Christ is calling apostles, why no women among them? That was the first question we should ask. And the second, when you go details to this thing, Paul was saying this in Corinthians because there is some places we have women prophets and this kind of their own way of establish their own institution that's overcrowding men. When they become a Christian, they think that how they are in their field, they will bring it to the church. They want to bring the roles they are playing on their field, controlling the society. They think that they can bring that to the church.
Yeah, in 1 Corinthians, the problem seems to be similar, not exactly the same, but similar. Women questioning, right? The speaker is the prophet is speaking, and the women are asking questions, disrupting things by asking questions. And Paul says, let them be quiet, and they can ask their questions at home. assuming they have husbands. And so, yeah, again, in all of these questions, and one of the things I would just urge you is to some humility. We have a lot of questions. There are a lot of questions surrounding this verse, this passage, surrounding 1 Corinthians 14. So whatever you come to, and it's fine to come to whatever opinion you do, I just say, come to it with a lot of humility, because there really are a lot of questions. What does Althantane mean exactly? It's hard to know. And it's hard to, because we don't know that, there's other things we're not sure of. Yeah, May?
Well, it's just like Jacob just said, why are there no women called to be apostles?
Mhm.
And then I
Great
think,
question.
and then just continuing reading in 1 Timothy 3, he gives the qualifications of what it takes to be in the roles that we have in the church, for elders, for deacons, and so forth. I mean, I don't question anything other than it says these are the qualifications if you're going to do this.
Yeah.
And
again,
I'm like Jacob, I agree with you. People want to bring stuff from where you are in the world into the church.
Yeah.
And we have to draw a line. We have to stick with what the scripture is teaching us. I mean,
and I would urge you to realize people who Christians who give more latitude to women in churches who give more latitude to women in their public roles are not doing so because they don't care about the scriptures. They're doing so because they believe the scriptures say something different, and they're emphasizing other scriptures and looking at these scriptures through a more culturally specific lens. And so I'm not trying to change your mind. I'm just saying,
I just think it's kind of,
it
kind of leaves you like, which way are we leaning? What's right? What's wrong? What's the right way to be? And what makes this right? And what makes this wrong?
And we're
like,
always,
where are we left?
We're always dealing with that, aren't we? We're always
Right,
having
so
that,
it's
we're always
like,
having to deal with that.
how
We're always having to come to
But
terms with that.
I
Think of Christians during the days of emancipation, and the texts that say, if you're a slave, don't wish to be freed. Obey your master, and that was easy to quote those scriptures and say, this is what the Bible says.
but that doesn't apply.
I'm not necessarily saying it's the same thing. I'm saying they were doing the same thing. They were working.
They did a
through those
lot of
same
things.
questions. They were working through those same questions. And so, yeah, so I mean, always we're dealing with that.
But it's like, where is the line? What do we follow or what do we don't follow? It's kind of, it leaves you up in the air, down. I don't know. What do you really do?
And Paul says, I think what the line is let's live these quiet lives that make sure that we're not obscuring the gospel, that we're not getting in the way of this gospel that in Christ all people can come to God through him, and that we're not doing anything in our lives that might get in the way of that. So I think that's I think that's where that's certainly what Paul's concerned about here in this chapter, and the questions that we have about these texts are always with us and are always going to be with us. We got another big one that we didn't get to for next week, which is women being saved through childbirth. So we'll see what we think.
I don't understand that.
Yeah, well, you know what? Nobody does, May, so don't worry about it.
Because I'm saved and I'm fine.
That's right. You're good. You're good.
I'm gonna sail in.
Right. No, we'll talk about that more next week and try to figure something out with that text. It's a tough one. I have a provisional understanding of it that I think that right now I think is pretty good. By next week I may have changed my mind, but we will see. But, all right, thanks everybody for your good comments. And
Good night.
Hope
Good night,
y'all have a great
everyone.
week.
Good night,
See you
everyone.
Sunday.
Bye.
Good night.
Form